The city's sky was painted a soft blue, but James barely noticed it. The clouds lazily drifted over the tall glass towers, and the people around him carried on with their lives without pausing for a moment. For him, however, the day carried an inexplicable heaviness. The city buzzed with activity, but James's heart beat to a different rhythm, one marked by the weight of absence, of what once was. The clock struck 1 in the afternoon when James decided to take one of his usual walks through the central square, a tradition he'd maintained since his business had started to take off. It was his escape, a time to clear his mind of the pressures of his company, but it was also the moment he had to face his own thoughts, those that never seemed to leave him in peace. The shadow of his past followed him with every step. Even though he had built a financial empire, the void in his life remained, as deep as it had been 15 years ago, when Sophia vanished without a trace. The wind, soft and warm, played with the leaves of the trees in the square. The hustle and bustle of the people ebbed and flowed. Tourists, families, and workers looking for a break in the middle of their day. Yet, amidst all that movement, a sound froze him. At first, it was a whisper, a distant echo, a melody barely audible amidst the city's noise. But as he drew closer, the notes became clearer. Each chord, each pause, gripped him tightly. It was impossible. It couldn't be. That song, their song. James felt a knot form in his stomach, a mix of disbelief and nostalgia. He stopped in the middle of his walk and turned on his heels, searching for the source of the melody. Time seemed to slow down. The people around him blurred in his peripheral vision as his ears focused solely on those notes, which seemed to come from the past. The rhythm, the cadence. It was the same song Sophia used to sing when they were together. The last song he heard before she disappeared from his life, before fate forced him to live with an open wound that never fully healed. Driven by a mixture of need and confusion, he began walking toward the center of the square. His steps were steady, but there was a tension in his chest that suffocated him. When he reached the fountain, his eyes landed on the image of a young woman. She was sitting on the edge of the fountain, eyes closed, her face radiating serene calm. Her voice was sweet and crystal clear. Every note that left her lips hung in the air like a whisper from times long gone. James watched her, feeling a strange déjà vu that made his blood boil. It wasn't just the song that disturbed him. The young woman. There was something about her appearance, her demeanor, the way the wind softly tousled her dark hair, that eerily reminded him of Sophia. Sweat began to bead on his forehead. For a second, he thought he was hallucinating, that his mind was playing tricks on him as it had so many times before. After all, memory could be treacherous, and his scarred heart always longed to find traces of Sophia wherever he looked. But this time was different, far too different. He took a deep breath and decided to approach. As his steps brought him closer to the young woman, the notes of the song seemed to intensify, as if the entire universe were conspiring to return the ghosts of his past to him. "Excuse me," he said, his voice barely a whisper, as if afraid of breaking the spell that the music had cast in the air. The young woman opened her eyes and looked at him in surprise. Her eyes were large and dark, hiding secrets within them. Her expression was kind, but she was clearly puzzled by the sudden interruption. "Can I help you with something?" she asked, with a slight smile, still observing him. Despite the confusion, there was a gentleness in her tone. James swallowed hard. He didn't know how to begin. Time felt like a whirlpool around him, pulling him between the present and memories of a painful past. Finally, he managed to articulate his thoughts. "That song you were singing, where did you learn it?" His voice came out firmer than he expected, but there was a tremble in his words that he couldn't hide. The young woman looked at him with curiosity, as if trying to figure out why a stranger would be so interested in a melody. "It's a song my mother used to sing when she was a child," she replied, shrugging casually. "She's always sung it at home. She taught it to me when I was little." James felt the ground beneath his feet tremble. Her mother. The words echoed in his mind over and over. Every word the young woman spoke pulled him deeper into a tangle of emotions he didn't know how to control. He tried to remain calm, to avoid jumping to hasty conclusions, but with each passing second, the doubt consumed him further. Your mother? What's her name? The words spilled out of his mouth uncontrollably, as if his body had decided before his mind could catch up. The young woman looked at him in surprise, as if the intensity in James's voice had alerted her to something unusual about him. But after a brief pause, she answered, "Her name is Sophia." James's world collapsed. His heart began to beat so violently he thought it might explode at any moment. The name settled in his chest like an unbearable weight. Sophia. The same name, the same song, the same face. It couldn't be a coincidence. The odds were infinitesimal. It was as if fate had guided him to this moment, as if everything he had suffered over the past 15 years had prepared him for this instant. But what did all of this mean? Who was this young woman? Could it be that? The questions overwhelmed him, but there was no time for easy answers. He needed to know more. He couldn't leave without discovering the truth. "I'm sorry, but I need to ask you one more thing," he said, almost with desperation in his voice. The young woman seemed increasingly perplexed but nodded softly, willing to listen. James took a deep breath and continued, knowing that what he was about to ask might change everything. James's heart continued to pound as he looked at the young woman sitting before him. The echo of the name Sophia resonated in his mind over and over, bringing with it a storm of emotions. He couldn't take his eyes off her, Valeria, who still stared at him with a mixture of curiosity and unease, clearly unsettled by the intensity of the encounter. "Your mother's name is Sophia?" he repeated, as if needing to confirm what he had already heard. Valeria nodded slowly. "Yes, why do you ask?" Her tone had changed now, no longer just the calm and kind young woman singing in the square. She had noticed the shift in James. Something in the way he looked at her, in the urgency of his questions, made her sense that something deeper was at play. James took a deep breath, trying not to get swept away by the avalanche of thoughts. He needed to stay in control, but his mind felt like a whirlwind. Could this girl really be Sophia's daughter? Was there something more? Something he didn't know? The coincidence was too great to be mere chance. And yet, he had to be sure. "I knew someone a long time ago," he began slowly, choosing his words carefully. "Someone who meant a lot to me. She used to sing that same song." Valeria looked at him, clearly more intrigued now. Her eyes narrowed as she studied him more closely. "You knew her?" she asked, leaning in slightly. "You knew my mother?" The words, "my mother," sent a shiver through James. The idea that this young woman in Valeria could be Sophia's daughter was too intense, too improbable, and yet, something in his heart told him he wasn't wrong. Still, he couldn't afford to jump to conclusions. If the past 15 years had taught him anything, it was that life could be cruelly unpredictable. "What is she like?" James asked, trying to sound casual, but his voice betrayed his anxiety. He needed more information. He needed to confirm what his mind refused to accept without evidence. Valeria shrugged, unaware of James's growing nervousness. "My mother is hard to describe. She's reserved, sometimes distant. She never talks much about her past. In fact, I know very little about what she did before I was born. But she's always been loving toward me. She raised me alone. I don't have a father, or at least, not one she's ever mentioned." That last sentence hit James like a hammer. "I don't have a father," she had said. His mind began connecting dots at a dizzying pace. Valeria's resemblance to Sophia, the song, the name. Everything pointed in one direction, and while part of him wanted to scream that it was impossible, the other part knew he had to dig deeper. He couldn't ignore the signs. "And she never spoke about your father?" James asked, his throat dry. He knew he was treading dangerous ground, but he had to know. Valeria shook her head, her expression growing darker. "No, never. Whenever I asked, she would dodge the question. Eventually, I stopped pushing. I learned to live without answers. Although I have to admit, I've always felt like something was missing, a piece I could never find. Something was missing. James understood that all too well. It was as if all the puzzle pieces were there, just slightly out of reach, impossible to fully connect. As Valeria spoke, memories of Sophia flooded his mind. He remembered the afternoons together, the conversations under the stars, and above all, the deep, visceral pain he felt when she disappeared. They had been so in love, so deeply connected. And then, suddenly, she was gone, without a word, without an explanation. For years, he had searched for her, used all his connections, spent fortunes, but he never found a trace of Sophia. Until now. "Would you mind telling me more about your mother?" he asked, trying not to sound too eager. "I mean, I don't want to pry, but she seems familiar. What was she like when you were a child?" Valeria looked at him for a long moment, as if deciding whether or not to trust him. Finally, after a pause, she shrugged and began to speak. "Well, like I said, she was always reserved. I know something happened to her before I was born, but she's never been clear about it. Sometimes I'd find her lost in her thoughts, staring into space. There were moments when she seemed really sad, but she never told me why. I guess we all carry things from the past that we'd rather not share, right?" James nodded, though every word Valeria spoke made his mind spin faster. Everything she described fit perfectly with the Sophia he had known, the Sophia who had disappeared without explanation. Could it be that she had secretly had a child? A child who now stood before him, unaware of who he truly was? The weight of that possibility almost overwhelmed him, but he couldn't rush into this. He needed proof, something tangible to confirm what his heart was already telling him. "You know, this might sound strange," James said, making a decision, "but I'd like to help you find answers about your father. Maybe together we can discover more about your past." Valeria looked at him in surprise. "Why are you so interested in this?" she asked bluntly. "I mean, we just met, and I don't mean to sound rude, but why do you care?" James remained silent for a moment. What could he say? He couldn't just tell her the whole truth. Not yet. Not without being sure. "Let's just say, it matters more to me than you realize," he replied quietly, his gaze fixed on her. "It's something I feel I need to do." Valeria looked at him, trying to read him. There was something about him, in the intensity of his stare, that unsettled her but at the same time piqued her curiosity. "All right," she said finally. "I guess I don't have much to lose. If you think you can help me find answers, then I'm in." James felt a momentary sense of relief, but he knew this was only the beginning. If he wanted to be sure of the truth, he would need more than words. He needed proof, and there was a way to get it. "Valeria," he began, knowing he was about to cross a delicate line, "have you ever thought about taking a DNA test? It might give us some clues about your origins." Valeria raised an eyebrow. "A DNA test? I've never considered it. Do you think that could help?" James nodded, though his heart was racing. "It could. It would tell us if there's a connection between your family and the person I'm thinking of." Valeria studied him for a long moment, weighing his words. Finally, she nodded slowly. "If you think it could help, I'll do it. I'm not afraid to find out the truth, whatever it may be." James felt a knot in his stomach. He was closer to the truth than he had ever been in the past 15 years. But he also knew that once the answers were in front of him, there would be no turning back. After that conversation in the square, where Valeria had agreed to take the DNA test, James felt torn. As they walked together through the streets leading to the lab, his mind struggled to process everything that was happening. Each step felt heavy, as if he were carrying not only his own past, but also the years lost and the unanswered questions that had tortured him for so long. The wind brushed his face, but the air felt dense, almost oppressive. The echo of Valeria's words still rang in his mind. "I don't have a father." The idea that this young woman, with her calm and serene gaze, could be his daughter overwhelmed him. Despite the growing connection he felt with her, something held him back from fully embracing the hope. Fear. What if the test confirmed what he suspected? What would he do then? He didn't know how to step into the role of a father after so many years of absence, not by choice, but by the circumstances that had torn them apart. And then, there was the looming shadow of Sophia. Where was she? And if Valeria truly was his daughter, why had Sophia never told him? It was as though the woman he had loved and lost was once again pushing him into a whirlwind of uncontrollable emotions. Valeria walked beside him in silence. She had agreed to the DNA test with a calmness James didn't fully understand. Perhaps for her, this wasn't as monumental as it was for him. Or maybe she couldn't yet grasp the scope of what they were about to uncover. James wondered if she, too, felt the same knot in her stomach, if she was also processing what this possibility might mean. Being her father would change everything, not just for him, but for Valeria as well. The clinic wasn't far, but the journey felt endless. Every corner they turned, every step closer to the lab, filled his mind with images of Sophia, of their happy moments, and finally, the bitterness of her disappearance. James would never forget the day Sophia vanished from his life. It had been a seemingly ordinary day. They had seen each other the night before, sharing a quiet dinner in his apartment. Sophia had been a little pensive that evening, quieter than usual, but James had attributed it to fatigue or the personal issues she never wanted to delve deeply into. The next morning, when he went to pick her up from where she lived, he found her apartment empty. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication that anything terrible had happened. Everything was perfectly in order, except for the fact that she was gone. The initial confusion quickly turned to panic. He called her friends, searched every place she frequented, but it was all in vain. Sophia had vanished, as if she had never existed. Days turned into weeks, and then into years. James searched for her tirelessly. He hired private investigators, used all the influence he had, spent small fortunes trying to find her, but he never received any answers. Eventually, the police closed the case, marking it as a missing person without a trace. But James never stopped wondering what had happened to her. Why did she leave? That was the question that tormented him. Sophia had meant everything to him. Though he hadn't known much about her past, what they had shared had been deep. Their connection had been palpable, real. And that was why the lack of answers had caused him an anguish that never truly went away. The clinic finally came into view, a modern building made of glass and steel in a quiet part of the city. James had chosen it carefully. It was a discreet place but had an impeccable reputation. He wanted everything to be handled with the utmost professionalism. There was no room for mistakes. Valeria glanced at him as they approached. "I didn't think all of this would happen so fast," she said quietly, as if sharing a private thought. Her words seemed to touch not just on the fact that they were about to take a DNA test, but also on how quickly their lives had begun to intertwine. James nodded. "Neither did I," he replied honestly. "But sometimes the things that matter most hit us all at once, without warning." When they entered the clinic, they were greeted by a receptionist who, with a professional smile, directed them to wait. The atmosphere was sterile, almost cold, with the typical smell of disinfectant lingering in the air. Despite everything seeming in order, James felt as though he were standing on the edge of an abyss. They took seats in the waiting room. The seconds seemed to stretch. James crossed his hands over his lap, feeling the sweat in his palms. He tried to concentrate, but his mind kept returning to Sophia. Would things have been different if he had known she was pregnant? That was one of the questions that haunted him. Could he have done something to prevent her disappearance? Was there something he hadn't seen, some sign, some cry for help that he had missed? The more he thought about it, the more he sank into a sea of self-criticism and regret. One night, shortly before her disappearance, Sophia and James had had a conversation that he didn't fully understand until now. They had been sitting in his living room, the lights dimmed, after a quiet dinner. Sophia had been distracted, her thoughts wandering far from the room. "James, do you think we could ever have a family?" she had asked suddenly, her tone vulnerable and soft. James, surprised by the question, had smiled. "Of course, Sophia. If that's what you want, We can have it all." She had smiled too, but there had been a shadow in her eyes. "Sometimes it's not as easy as it seems," she had murmured, almost to herself. At the time, he hadn't thought much of her words. They had been happy, or at least, he had thought they were. But now, looking back, he wondered if Sophia had already been dealing with something bigger, something he hadn't been able to grasp. Was it fear that had driven her to leave? Had she been protecting Valeria, or herself, from something he never knew? Finally, they were called in. The process was faster than James had anticipated. The lab technicians were efficient, professional, but despite the simplicity of the procedure, the tension in the air was palpable. The blood test was quick. The pain of the needle was insignificant compared to the emotional battle raging inside James. As he watched Valeria submit to the test, he couldn't help but feel a deep connection to her, one that went beyond the current circumstances. It was almost instinctive, as if deep down, his heart already knew the truth, even though his mind still resisted fully accepting it. When they were done, Valeria looked at him with a calm expression, though there was a flicker of anxiety in her eyes. "So, what happens now?" she asked. James was silent for a moment, his eyes locked with hers. What would happen now? That was the question they both shared, though perhaps with different meanings. "Now, we just have to wait," he finally said, his voice soft but filled with restrained emotion. They left the lab in silence, walking together down the sidewalk, though the weight of what had just happened followed them like an invisible shadow. The days that followed were unbearable. James buried himself in his work, trying to distract himself from the growing anxiety that consumed him. Every time his phone rang, his heart would briefly stop, waiting for it to be the lab results. But at the same time, he dreaded that moment. He dreaded what the results might reveal. The nights were the worst. Alone in his spacious apartment, James found himself reliving memories of the past, over and over again, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. Sophia's face haunted him, both in his dreams and in his waking thoughts. What had her life been like after she left? Why had she left? The questions never stopped, and now they were joined by new uncertainties about Valeria. One of his last happy memories with Sophia was at his countryside house. They had spent a weekend together, far from the noise of the city. It was the place where they felt most connected, where the pressures of their lives seemed to fade away. He remembered that night, as they watched the stars from the terrace. Sophia had snuggled close to him and whispered, "I'll never leave you, James." But that promise had been broken. And now, years later, the only answer to all the questions he had lay in the hands of Valeria, the young woman who might be the only legacy of his lost love. Finally, the day came when the lab sent the results. James received the notification on his phone, his heart racing as he opened the email. Sitting in his office, his hands trembled as he clicked on the attachment. The room seemed quieter than usual, as if the entire world were holding its breath with him. When he read the first lines, time seemed to stop. The test was conclusive. Valeria wasn't just a coincidence or a mirage created by his memories. She was his daughter. James stared at the words on the screen, feeling a mix of emotions so intense that he could barely breathe. Silent tears began to well up in his eyes as he processed what it all meant. He had been a father all this time. And Sophia? Had she known? Had she left his life to protect Valeria, or simply to escape everything? A new truth stood before him, and the weight of the years lost fell heavily on his shoulders. Now, he had to face Valeria with the truth. James observed the city from the window of his luxurious apartment, lost in his thoughts. The DNA test results sat on the table, just a single sheet of paper, yet carrying a weight far beyond its appearance. Emily was his daughter. What had begun as a chance meeting in a crowded square had now transformed into something much deeper and more personal. 15 years had passed since Sophia vanished from his life without explanation, taking not only his love, but also an essential part of his being. And now, within just a few days, the daughter he never knew existed had appeared, unraveling a revelation that left him completely disoriented. But there was something else, something dark that had always lingered at the edges of his thoughts when he remembered Sophia. William. His name had been mentioned briefly in earlier conversations with Emily, but now it seemed to be a critical figure in this entire mystery. Who was William, really? Just the mention of his name stirred an uneasiness in James that he couldn't fully explain. All of this weighed heavily on him as he prepared for what he was about to do. Confront Sophia. What would he say to her when he saw her? How would the reunion unfold after so many years of silence, secrets, and pain? Most importantly, why had Sophia kept Emily's existence a secret? The sound of the doorbell interrupted his thoughts. Emily had arrived. She was here to face the truth with him, but more than that, she was here to confront her mother. The confrontation between James and Emily. James opened the door and found Emily standing there, her face serious but expectant. Her expression revealed the inner battle she was fighting. Since discovering that James was her father, she had been incredibly strong. But now the gravity of the moment was beginning to weigh on both of them. "Do you have the results?" Emily asked, her eyes fixed on the envelope James was holding. There was no hesitation in her tone. She wanted the truth, and she wanted it now. James nodded and invited her in. They both sat down in the spacious living room, the envelope the focus of their attention. James placed it on the table, but Emily didn't immediately reach for it. She seemed to be processing what she was about to uncover, as though her life was about to split into two distinct parts, before and after knowing the truth. "Emily," James began cautiously, his voice soft yet filled with emotion. "I've read the results. I know what they say." Emily locked eyes with him, not blinking. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice tense. "Are you my father?" James nodded, momentarily unable to speak. The words he had rehearsed in his mind felt hollow compared to the reality of the moment. "Yes, Emily, I'm your father." The silence that followed was overwhelming. Emily picked up the envelope, her hands trembling as she opened it. Her eyes scanned the lines of the report, confirming what James had just told her. The DNA test was conclusive. She wasn't just a coincidence. She was his daughter. Emily let the report drop onto the table and remained silent. Her gaze shifted between the paper and James, trying to grasp the weight of what she had just learned. She had spent her entire life without knowing who her father was, and now that void was filled by a man she had only recently met. "Why didn't my mother ever tell me?" Emily asked finally, her voice breaking under the weight of her emotions. "Why did she keep me in the dark all these years?" James felt a sharp pain hearing those words. "Why, Sophia?" He had asked himself that question for so long, but now he realized that Emily had suffered just as much from that absence. He hadn't just lost Sophia, both of them had lost the chance to be a family. "I don't know," James whispered. "I don't know why Sophia kept this from you, or why she disappeared without telling me anything. But I want to know, Emily. I need to understand." Emily looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of pain and determination. "I need to know too. I need her to explain why she did this." James nodded, knowing that they were both seeking the same answers. "We're going to find her," James said, his voice more resolute now. "We're going to talk to her, and this time, I won't let her leave without explaining everything." Before setting off for the small coastal town where Sophia lived, James and Emily spent the night in the apartment, preparing not just for the physical journey but also for the emotional one. Emily had retreated to one of the rooms to be alone with her thoughts, while James sat in the living room, gazing at the city lights through the window. It was 2 a.m, but James wasn't tired. His mind was filled with memories of Sophia. Over the years, he had tried to block those thoughts, believing they were too painful to relive. But now that he was so close to finding her again, the memories flooded back with overwhelming clarity. James closed his eyes and remembered the early weeks of his relationship with Sophia. They had met at a charity event he had organized to raise funds for his company. Sophia didn't quite fit into the corporate world, but there was a charm about her that captivated him from the first moment. There was something mysterious about her, something that drew him in deeply. He remembered how they would spend hours talking in his apartment, sharing dreams and laughter. But there were also times when Sophia would become distant. Sometimes, when he thought they were getting closer, she would pull back, as though she had built a wall he could never fully break through. And though he always offered her his unconditional love, there was something Sophia was never willing to share. There was one night James would never forget, just a few months before her disappearance. They had been at his countryside house outside the city, sitting under the starry sky, talking about their future. Sophia had been unusually quiet that night, and when he asked her if something was wrong, she had only looked at him with an expression he had never been able to fully interpret. "Have you ever felt like you can't escape your past?" she had asked, her voice barely a whisper. James had looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" Sophia had turned her gaze to the stars, as if searching for answers there. "Sometimes I feel like there are things we can't leave behind, no matter how much we want to." That conversation had stayed with him, though he hadn't fully understood what Sophia had been trying to say. Now, as he recalled that night, everything made sense. Sophia had already been dealing with the shadows of her past, carrying the weight of a secret she had never wanted to share with him. Back in the present, James opened his eyes, feeling a mix of nostalgia and pain. Sophia had loved him, he was sure of that, but something had pushed her away from him, and now he was determined to find out what it had been. James knew that Emily, too, was processing her thoughts. The young woman had spent her life without a father figure, and now, suddenly, her world had turned upside down. How was she handling it all? He wondered if Emily had ever suspected that there was more to her story, that her father's absence wasn't just a choice her mother had made, but something much darker. The drive to the small coastal town where Sophia had been living was quiet at first. James and Emily traveled by car, but words seemed to elude them. There was so much they wanted to say to each other, but none of it seemed appropriate for that moment. Emily stared out the window as the landscape slowly shifted from buildings to open fields. The city lights faded behind them, and the horizon opened up before them. James kept his hands firmly on the wheel, but his mind wandered between memories of Sophia and the confrontation that was about to take place. Emily couldn't stop thinking about her mother. Sophia had always been an enigmatic figure in her life. Though she loved her deeply, Emily had always felt there was a barrier between them, something Sophia never wanted to share. She had grown up feeling protected, yes, but also with a sense of emptiness, a part of her life that had always been left unanswered. "Why did you hide the truth from me?" That was the question that had been running through her mind ever since she discovered that James was her father. Her whole life, Emily had felt the absence of a father, and though she had asked her mother about him countless times, Sophia always avoided the topic, giving vague responses or simply changing the subject. Emily used to imagine her father as someone heroic, someone who had to leave for some important reason, but she had never thought that her mother had actively lied about his existence. Now, as they drove toward the confrontation, Emily felt a mix of anger, sadness, and confusion. How could she trust someone who had hidden something so important from her for her entire life? Despite her anger, a small part of Emily still wanted to understand. She needed the truth to heal. She needed to know why her mother had made such painful decisions. James, as he drove, felt the past and present colliding in his mind. The images of Sophia from the early years of their relationship kept resurfacing, blending with the reality that he would soon see her again. 15 years was a long time to process, yet it felt like the moment of reunion had come too quickly. His thoughts returned to William. He didn't know exactly who this man was, but he suspected that he had been a key figure in Sophia's disappearance. From the beginning, Sophia had always carried a shadow with her, a kind of inexplicable sadness that James had never fully understood. Had William been the cause of all that? Had he been the one to force her to disappear, to leave behind the life they had begun to build together? James knew that the answers he sought wouldn't be easy to obtain, nor easy to accept. But one thing was clear. He was determined to protect Emily and ensure that William would no longer control their lives. They finally arrived at the small coastal town by late afternoon. The shadows were growing longer as the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple. Sophia's house was located on the outskirts of town, near the beach, isolated and discreet. It wasn't the kind of place he had expected after knowing Sophia in the bustling city. James parked the car, and they both stepped out in silence, gazing at the small house before them. This was where Sophia had been hiding all these years. Emily looked at the door with her heart racing. She was about to confront her mother, the woman who had kept the truth hidden from her for her entire life. "Are you ready?" James asked, though he wasn't sure if he himself was prepared for what was about to happen. Emily nodded slowly. "I have to be," she replied, though the truth was, she had no idea how to handle what would come next. James took a deep breath and knocked on the door. It was only a few seconds, but those moments felt like an eternity. Finally, the door opened, and Sophia stood before them. Sophia was there, standing in front of them, but time had taken its toll on her. Though she was still beautiful, there was something in her eyes that showed the pain and exhaustion of the years. She wasn't the radiant woman James remembered, but she was still Sophia, the woman he had loved and lost. When Sophia saw James, her face filled with shock and fear. But when her gaze landed on Emily behind him, her eyes immediately filled with tears. She knew the moment had come, and all her secrets were about to come crashing down. "James, Emily," Sophia murmured, her voice trembling. She took a step back, as if she couldn't bear the reality of what was happening. "Sophia," James said softly, though his voice was heavy with emotion. "We need to talk. No more secrets." Sophia lowered her head, her expression filled with regret. "I know," she said quietly. "I know." The three of them sat down in the small living room of the house, but the air was thick with tension. Sophia could barely look her daughter in the eye, and Emily seemed to be holding back all the pain she felt in that moment. She knew she was about to face a painful truth. "Why, Mom?" Emily was the first to break the silence, her voice a whisper filled with disbelief and hurt. "Why didn't you ever tell me who my father was? Why did you keep me in the dark all these years?" Sophia let out a choked sob, covering her face with her hands. Tears began to fall uncontrollably. She had been waiting for this moment for years, but now that it was here, she didn't know how to face it. "I never wanted you to know, because I thought it was what was best for you." "What was best for me?" Emily repeated, incredulous. "What could have been better than knowing my father? Why did you do this to me?" James, who had remained silent, watching the exchange between mother and daughter, finally spoke. "Sophia, we need to understand. Why did you disappear? Why did you leave me without any explanation?" Sophia looked at James, her eyes filled with guilt. The weight of 15 years of secrets and wrong decisions was visible in every word she was about to say. "All of this, everything I did, was to protect you and Emily," Sophia said, her voice breaking with emotion. "William, he wasn't going to let me go. He wasn't going to let me have a life with you." James frowned, William's name echoing in his mind. "Who is William? What did he do to you?" Sophia took a deep breath, trying to calm herself enough to speak. "William was a man I knew long before you, James. At the time, I didn't know what I was getting into. He was powerful. He had influence everywhere. And at first, I thought I could walk away from him. But when I got pregnant with Emily, everything changed." James and Emily exchanged a glance. The truth was beginning to come out, and it wasn't what either of them had expected. "When William found out I was pregnant, he told me that if I didn't leave you, he would do everything he could to destroy our lives," Sophia continued. "He threatened me. He said if I stayed with you, he would make sure you disappeared, and that our daughter would grow up without either of us. I had no choice. I had to leave. I had to protect both of you." Sophia's words cut into James like a knife. All this time, he had believed that Sophia had simply abandoned him, that she had left without a reason. But now, He was discovering that everything had been a lie woven out of fear and threats from a man who had controlled her life from the shadows. "Why didn't you tell me?" James asked, his voice full of hurt. "We could have faced this together." Sophia let out a louder sob, shaking her head. "I was scared. William was watching me, always close, making sure I didn't try to come back to you. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to protect you." The weight of the secrets became unbearable in the small room. Emily sat silently, processing everything her mother had just said. William had been present in her life without her knowing, controlling not only her mother but also her own destiny. "So all this time," Emily's voice was quiet, "all this time, you lived in fear of him?" Sophia nodded, her face filled with guilt. "Yes, even here, far from the city, I always felt that William was watching us. I never felt completely free." James stood up from his seat, unable to contain the fury building inside him. "No more," he said, his voice full of determination. "William has controlled our lives for too long. We're going to stop him." With Sophia's revelations in mind, James, Emily, and Sophia came together to track down William and put an end to his control. Although he had been careful to cover his tracks, they eventually managed to trace his movements thanks to the information Sophia had kept over the years. The search was slow and dangerous, but finally, they managed to locate William. The confrontation was inevitable. William, still arrogant and full of the confidence his power had given him, tried to manipulate them once again, using the same fear and threats he had wielded for so long. But this time, James and Emily weren't going to back down. With the evidence Sophia had accumulated over the years, and with the help of the authorities, William was arrested. The man who had destroyed their lives was finally out of the picture. With William gone from their lives, James, Emily, and Sophia began to rebuild their relationships. The path to healing wasn't easy, but the fact that they had faced and overcome the figure who had caused so much damage gave them the strength to move forward. James and Sophia spent time repairing what they had lost, while Emily, who finally knew the truth about her origins, began to form a new bond with her father. The years of absence couldn't be erased, but the present and future offered them a chance to start anew. One afternoon, as they walked together along the beach near Sophia's home, Emily stopped and looked out at the horizon. "Do you think we can really start over?" she asked, her voice full of hope and caution. James, standing beside her, looked out at the sea, then at Sophia, who was walking a few steps ahead. He smiled softly and nodded. "Yes, Emily, I believe we can. Thanks for watching our story. If you were as captivated as we were, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming stories full of emotion, suspense, and unexpected revelations. Leave us a comment below. What did you think of James and Valeria's incredible journey? What would you have done in their place? We want to hear your thoughts. Every comment inspires us to keep creating more content that excites you. And don't leave just yet. The next story is waiting for you on the screen. If you like this one, the next one will leave you speechless. Subscribe, comment, and keep watching.